I see everybody's come out of hiding after the papal visit, I appreciate all of you guys being here, and it's a great pleasure to have Eben Kirksey visiting us here today. Eben is currently the Curry and Thomas Barron Visiting Professor in the Environment and Humanities at Princeton, and he's a permanent faculty member in the Environmental Humanities program at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Can everybody hear me? Is this good? Okay. Eben got his doctoral degree in 2008 at the University of California at Santa Cruz in the History of Consciousness program. And there he studied with Jim Clifford, Donna Haraway, Anand Singh, and Don Brennis, and whose many works we all know. And since completing his PhD, Eben has published 2 monographs and 2 edited volumes. His latest book, Emergent Ecologies from Duke, uses artwork and contemporary philosophy to demonstrate hopeful ways of rethinking key issues and key problems in conservation biology. He tracks the coexistence of capital interests and nomadic forms of ecological and human life in Panama, Costa Rica, and the US, and how this coexistence shapes multi-species communities and new approaches to environmental management. Writing in collaboration with MIT Stefan Helmreich, he coined the term multi-species ethnography for studying the often invisible biosocial contact zones where lines dividing nature and culture often break down, but also where new kinds of unexpected ecologies and politics can emerge. So in short, Eben crosses conventional divides in the social sciences, biology, humanities, and art, and is really at the cutting edge of the environmental humanities today. And our first speaker, ecologist Dan Jansen, gave us a sense of how to think about these emergent ecological assemblages. But here the story of biodiversity and extinction more directly involves the actions, legacies, occupations, and fantasies of humans themselves. When he's looking at the edges of these processes, he's putting the word extinction and the word hope in the same sentence, so that's a pretty amazing move. I should also say for the undergraduates who are here that Eben was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University. He began his anthropological work with a study of the damming of a major river in West Papua, a mega project which threatened to flood one of the least explored areas of the planet, and that changed forever the lives of its nomadic inhabitants. And Eben has been testifying about the human rights abuses there ever since in news outlets such as The Guardian, the Huffington Post, and in U.S. congressional hearings. Eben's talk is entitled The Amphibian Ark, Hope, Happiness, and Glass. So let's give a warm welcome to Eben Kirksey.
Thanks so much for having me and for the very, very generous introduction. So I understand that Dan Jansen's talk problematized the notion of species-specific conservation. And what I'm going to offer you today is an exploration of this ambivalent thing that one does when one saves a species. So this is an ethnographic account of what it's like to save a particular species, the golden frog of Panama. But today I'll also illustrate a modest proposal for doing the work of biopolitics, managing life and death differently. So currently the American Zoological Association is making some missteps, I think, as they're managing the life and death of this one species. And I'm going to show you an artwork that is a concrete proposal for managing that life differently. So this is a preview of this book that's coming out in November, and this talk about saving one specific species is against the backdrop of ecologies that are emerging all around us. And I want people to think this phrase, emergent ecologies, not just in terms of the outside, you know, what's outside of our houses, what's in our backyards, or in blasted landscapes that have been transformed by capital and then abandoned, but also to think about the ecologies that exist within our own homes, that might be reworked and reconfigured to be livelier places. So in this book, I describe how emergences can destroy the existing order, and the backdrop to this slide is an up-close and personal picture of amphibian skin that has been infected by the chytrid fungus, and I'll say a lot more about the chytrid fungus today. So the chytrid fungus, that's known by its initials, BD, is an emergent disease that has found novel exploits, pathways of transmission, and modes of existence. This microbe, like many other emergent diseases, has quickly transformed dominant political strategies, economic systems, and agricultural practices. The broader book also talks about how emergences can figure into collective hopes. So, in the aftermath of a clear-cut forest or a volcanic eruption, emergent plants are the first ones to sprout. I'm interested in assemblages and associations that are able to exploit faults and fissures within established communities. These assemblages contain the promise of supplanting deeply rooted structures. I'm focusing on forms of life that materialize in interstitial spaces, the in-between places. At the intersection of divided forces, emergent forms of life can disrupt ostensibly unified systems. False starts in one direction can become significant beginnings along a new vector. Flying in the face of long-term agendas, unexpected detours and happy accidents can generate a novel sense of order. So I'm going to talk about a project that I did with Grayson Earl, who's pictured here, with a lovely t-shirt. I'm a post-Pastorian. That's a phrase from Heather Paxson. And this project is getting us to think and speak differently about the extinction event that's happening in amphibian worlds right now. So amphibians are arguably the class of animals that we should be paying most attention to right now in thinking about extinctions. 41% of them are currently classified as being threatened, according to the IUCN, and that's compared with only 13% of birds and 25% of mammals. So this artwork that Grayson's going to introduce is what George Marcus would call a para-ethnographic object. In plain language, that just means a conversation piece, something to get us speaking and thinking differently about distributed assemblages. A way of provoking people who are implicated in the management of the life of others, getting them to speak and think differently about the issues at hand. So I'm going to let Grayson introduce it with a film.
Utopia for the Golden Frog is a collaborative bioart project between Eben Kirksey, Grayson Earl, and Mike Gaddafi, in which we salvaged a discarded appliance, a refrigerator, in order to build a safe haven for a dying species, the golden frog of Panama. And you might ask, well, why is it extinct in the wild to begin with? And it's complicated, so we'll be brief. There's another frog from South Africa, Xenopus. Now this frog is immune to a fungus known as chytrid, but is an excellent carrier for that fungus. And because the Western world used Xenopus for pregnancy tests in the mid-20th century, it was shipped around the world carrying the amphibian-killing fungus with it. We've been testing frogs for chytrid and hoping to raise awareness about the plight of infected amphibians. There are some places that are untouched by chytrid, which is why we want to help people to build their own amphibian utopias and start thinking about science and conservationism as something that we can do as citizens.
So I'm going to come back to that artwork we did at the very end of the talk, but just use it to frame my ethnographic descriptions of how life is actually managed at this transnational assemblage of zoological facilities, cryogenic banks where they're freezing frogs, as well as places like this where they're keeping living frogs alive beyond the reach of this emergent disease. So this is situated in the highlands of Panama in a volcano crater, and they basically created this biosecure facility to keep out the fungus. A comfortable breeze from the air conditioner, a steady 24 degrees Celsius, hits her in the face. She was greeted by the familiar bubbling from the aeration tubes and the hum of the air pumps. The slash-chink rhythm of Mario's machete cutting the grass outside was still audible over the automated systems of evac, the El Valle Amphibian Conservation Center. She washed her hands with antibacterial soap in the sink and put on a pair of powderless rubber gloves. At the top of the new page in the log, a cheap spiral notebook, she wrote, 28 December 2008, Adelopus Room. Peering in the first couple of tanks, she found little to report in the log. 0 fecal, 0 food left, 1 frog on plant, 1 frog hiding in peat moss. Spritzing each tank with a blast from the garden hose with the nozzle turned to the mist setting, she quickly moved down the row. So this place has been critiqued by Lucy Cook. She writes the Amphibian Avenger blog. She basically goes around the world writing about amphibians and has this blog doing work similar to me. She's something like an ethnographer of frogs. And she describes EVAC as a terrifying vision of the future where frogs survive in sterile pods and Crocs are mandatory footwear. You see the green Crocs down there. The Amphibian Avenger blog is dedicated, quote, to the ugly, to the freakish, and the unloved animals that are perilously ignored thanks to the tyranny of the cute. When Lucy Cook visited EVAC, she was delighted to find freakish species living alongside other frogs that might conventionally be considered cute. So among the freakish frogs are ones that actually have their young burrowing into their back and then sort of emerge as live frogs after feasting on the flesh of their parents. During my own visit to EVAC, I found human caretakers who had become emotionally and ethically entangled with creatures in their care. People who were committed to the practical labor of keeping frogs alive and flourishing in an era of extinction. Rather than terrifying visions of the future, I found practical applications of Donna Haraway's cyborg politics, a politics which involves forging new links between biotic elements and technology. Organisms and machines are joined together here to ground modest hopes, creating the possibility for a shared future involving people and frogs. The EVAC facility is a fragile bubble of happiness that is sustained by this husband and wife team. This is Edgardo Griffiths on the right and his wife Heidi on the left. Edgardo is from Panama, Heidi's from the States. And they created this facility in response to a growing sense of dread as the chytrid fungus spread across the highlands of Central America. And the fungus moved like a wave. You could see it. There would be vibrant frog populations in a given place, and then like a few months later, they would be dead. So this is a picture of golden frogs that was taken right after the fungal wave hit El Valle. In March 2006, Edgardo spotted a dead frog in a stream near El Valle. Its limbs were splayed out. Its skin was peeling. He scooped it up, and he went home and cried. As the disease hit, Edgardo and Heidi set about collecting frogs, keeping them in conditions of strict biosecurity. They began working as bricoleurs and entrepreneurs. They assembled networks of organisms and objects, making do with beings and things that were ready at hand. Hundreds of frogs took up temporary residence with them in a few vacant rooms of Hotel Campistre, a backpacker hotel in El Valle that donated a couple of rooms to the cause. Edgardo and Heidi began to cobble together everyday technologies into a life support system that protected the frogs from the pathogenic fungus. Against the backdrop of mass death of loved animals, Edgardo and Heidi engaged in the practical labor of maintaining optimism and hope, helping maintain a world so that some good elements of life could continue. Good feelings began to accumulate around particular species of endangered frogs. And borrowing the words of Sarah Ahmed, we might understand these individual animals as sticky objects. Smiling, laughing, expressing optimism about what is possible will affect others, according to Ahmed. Being with and around a person in a good mood gives a certain lightness, humor, and energy to shared spaces. And this energy can make those spaces into happy objects, what we direct good feelings towards. Alongside their practical labor, Edgardo and Heidi struggled to perform the emotional and imaginative labor to sustain EVAC as a happy space where people could take pleasure in the well-being of animals that had this magnetizing power of attachment. But their feelings were fragile, like glass. Edgardo and Heidi recognized that their isolated local effort at the EVAC facility in the highlands of Panama was not capable of addressing the global crisis at hand. One night they showed me a YouTube video after a long, hard day of cleaning out frog tanks. This video was helping them hold on to hope and happiness, they said. This video was from Kevin Zippel, who founded the Amphibian Ark. He was bringing Messianic tropes together with capitalism to save frogs in an era of extinction. With this video, Zippel launched a $50 million capital campaign, an endowment to preserve endangered species forever. He branded this campaign 2008, the Year of the Frog. Heidi and Edgardo told me that Kevin was doing the difficult labor of sustaining hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. They told me that Zippel was helping them hold on to hope and happiness as they went through their mind-numbing daily routines, taking care of thousands of animals in their facility, against a prevailing sense of homogeneous, empty time, when nothing really seemed to change, even amidst definitive extinction events. Kevin Zippel was trying to open up revolutionary possibilities with his Messianic language. And I'm going to show you this YouTube video that we watched together one night.
Saving species in the wild is our greatest priority. You can put a fence around a forest, and that will keep out the loggers, the poachers, maybe the invasive species, but it's not going to keep out disease, and it's certainly not going to keep out climate change. For hundreds of species, the only hope is temporary sanctuary in captivity, to be brought in and managed until those threats are mitigated in the wild, and once again, those species can be returned. And that is the role of the Amphibian Ark. We're a global network of stakeholders, including zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, natural history museums, universities, the private sector, all working collaboratively on these cooperative programs. Our mission is working in partnerships to ensure the global survival of our amphibians, focusing on those that cannot be safeguarded in the wild and would otherwise go extinct without our help.
It's a longer video, and in this video, Kevin's rhetoric echoes Al Gore's language from An Inconvenient Truth, a film about global warming. That film has a secular apocalyptic narrative. It is a revoicing of environmental science in the language of evangelical Christianity, and this is according to Susan Friend Harding, who's doing this kind of work with Protestant Christians long before the current Pope. I think this topic is very timely this week. These narratives, according to Harding, are Jeremiads, a type of Protestant political sermon that laments the fact that people have fallen into sinful ways and face ruin unless they swiftly reform. Doom is imminent, but it is conditional. It's not inevitable. It can be reversed by human action, but time is short. Kevin goes on to talk about frogs as canaries in the coal mine, these animals that stand in as surrogates for people. So if the canary died when there was toxic fumes in the mine, these frogs are going extinct and prefiguring a possible event in Kevin's imagination, the extinction of the human species. I think we can engage with Kevin's work with a little bit of help from Jacques Derrida, who makes a distinction between apocalyptic and Messianic thinking. Messianic hopes proliferate against the backdrop of seemingly impossible odds, amidst dashed dreams and disappointing circumstances. Looking to possible futures rather than absolute endings, Derrida suggests that these hopes contain the attraction, the invincible elan, or an affirmation of an unpredictable future to come. Derrida insists, not only must one not renounce this emancipatory desire, it is necessary to insist on it more than ever. As the figurehead at the head of the Amphibian Ark, Kevin Zippel was not just focused on definitive endings. this apocalyptic thinking critiqued by Derrida and many others. Zippel was working to embody the Messianic spirit. As scores of frog species were going extinct, he was trying to open up a moment of revolutionary time, a moment when collective hopes about saving the environment or preserving nature might coalesce around the future of actual animals. Derrida suggests that we should embrace the Messianic by literally expecting the unexpected, by waiting for mysterious possibilities that are beyond our own imaginative horizons. In a key passage, Derrida talks about the Messianic as if one is waiting in an empty desert. And his specific phrase is messianicity without messianism. And he says that waiting in that desert, one is literally waiting for nothing. There's no sort of pre-imagined event or Messiah or figure that's going to show up and save the day, but it's that expecting the unexpected, which produces interesting possibilities for Derrida. So Derrida would have us wait for nothing in particular, and in contrast to this, Zippel's imagination, Kevin Zippel, is focused on something more specific, creating a livable future for a multitude of endangered animals. Kevin was grounding modest biocultural hopes in hybrid assemblages of nature, culture, and technology. Working to galvanize the conservation community, Zippel hoped to raise an endowment to preserve frogs for eternity in biosecure breeding facilities and cryogenic banks. He was trying to show others the magnetizing power of amphibians, to generate contagious feelings of happiness around efforts to preserve their endurance, their well-being, their survival. Happiness, as I've said earlier, is fragile. It's like a bubble. It can shatter like glass at any moment. The year of the frog, 2008, coincided with global financial disaster. Failing to raise even a fraction of their ambitious goal, raising less than $1 million out of their $50 million goal of their capital campaign, the Amphibian arc barely stayed afloat. They barely covered their 2008 operating expenses. While working in Panama, I began to focus my attention on one species, the one pictured here, the golden frog, that had become a flagship species in Kevin Zippel's international campaign. You can see it here pictured on a Visa card that you could buy to donate money every time you made a purchase, or dressed in a Santa hat. Golden frogs had become surrogates, standing in for other unloved frogs in fundraising campaigns, and I think Dan Jansen probably talked about the problem of that sort of mode of conservation biology. So these charismatic animals captivated the imaginations of professional conservation biologists, volunteers, and donors because they fit this new hopeful storyline. On the brink of extinction within their native ecological communities, the golden frog was being saved by technical and scientific interventions. As the species reportedly went extinct in the wild in 2008, the same year as the year of the frog, Edgardo and Heidi became famous, since they were keeping the last known populations in Panama alive within their facility. Golden frogs are featured on Panamanian lottery tickets and have been scripted into stories about national patrimony and heritage. Locally, the couple became renowned for their golden frogmobile. They drove this Jeep painted yellow and black. I worked alongside them, caring for frogs. I learned how they were navigating oblique powers, structuring uneasy north-south relations. They were wrangling with diverging values and obligations, exploring non-hierarchical modes of coexistence with large institutions in the U.S. How am I doing on time? How much time do we have for a history lesson here?
If you want, 1 o'clock, and then we have questions and discussion.
Okay, I'll give you a long history lesson then.
Okay.
So part of these uneasy north-south relations that Heidi and Edgardo were navigating are a result of a long history of U.S. empire in the region. So Panama was under U.S. military occupation for nearly 100 years. President Teddy Roosevelt helped create the nation of Panama in 1903, supporting separatist insurgents against Colombia. On the heels of this military action, the U.S. took over the construction of the Panama Canal. So in the longer book, I rewind past 100 years of history to early U.S. military adventures in Central America, and then fast forward back again to produce a parallax effect, to bring political and economic forces that have shaped the ecology of Central Panama into sharp relief. The essay that I've circulated to the graduate students, Hope in the Reverted Zone, describes my own ethnographic adventures in the city of knowledge, a place where Michel Foucault would have had a field day. In this place, I found competing utopic dreams. When I first visited Panama in 1997, I found dreams of the nation tied to the relative absence of a specific figure, the gringo. So basically, the gringo, like the frogs, had become a sticky object of sorts. People in Panama started linking all sorts of bad feelings instead of happy feelings to the gringo. Diverse problems, economic inequality, human rights abuses, failing water infrastructure, access to land for farming and hunting were all figured as problems that the gringo brought. Panamanians started pinning their hopes on an imagined event, the moment that the gringo would leave, never again to return. And as that moment approached on the horizon, as December 31st, 1999 got close, this was coinciding with the coming of a new millennium. A sense of homogeneous and empty time quickly gave way to a sense of messianic time. This is what the City of Knowledge looks like today. And another shot of the City of Knowledge, this domain of modern wonder. So if the magical realism animating earlier dreams in Latin America, the Macondo, described by Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel 100 Years of Solitude, has been displaced, I think. It's been displaced by Mick-ondo, the enchanted domain of McDonald's and modern wonder. So when I returned to Panama in 2014 on my latest trip before finishing this book, I found that instead of envisioning sweeping social and political changes, people were talking about their desires for professional advancement, wanting to buy a new car or a house. They were talking about dreams of entering heaven or winning the lottery. So Heidi and Edgardo are struggling to keep hopes for frogs alive against that backdrop of a middle-class utopia. The frogs who experience the ambivalent grace of salvation at the amphibian art probably do not share the subjective feelings of happiness, sometimes experienced by their human caretakers like Edgardo and Heidi. Frogs have very different faces from people. Our smiles, big toothy grins, likely look very different to these small, vulnerable animals when we lovingly grasp them in our hands. Sarah Ahmed notes that many people experience inappropriate affects that are out of sync with social expectations. The figure of the unhappy bride on her wedding day is one of the examples that Ahmed studies. We become strangers or affect aliens in such moments, she writes. Endangered animals are probably also often alienated from human affects. While zoos and other breeding facilities style themselves as salvic arcs bearing life's remnant and our hopes for redemption, this rhetoric often masks widespread feelings of unhappiness and even hidden regimes of violence. As the messianic vision of Kevin Zippel's largely failed to materialize in the absence of an endowment capable of sustaining the life of endangered frog species forever, Edgardo and Heidi soldiered on with limited resources, working to imagine and craft better futures for animals in their facility. Others, with different political and ethical commitments, adopted more violent forms of care. So it turns out that golden frogs were airlifted out of Panama in 1999, the very same year that the U.S. military occupation was coming to an end. This was done by the Baltimore Zoo and Aquarium, and under the Endangered Species Act, they were given the license to import these animals and actually given ownership of the species under U.S. law. The Baltimore Zoo and Aquarium initially experienced joy and happiness at their breeding success. The animals in their care produced 2,000 babies every time they bred. But quickly, that happiness turned to despair when they realized they didn't have the facilities to house these animals. They began sending them to other zoos in little Tupperware containers with paper towels. After the zoological network ran out of space, and you can find these animals anywhere now. You can find them at Disney World, you can find them at the Houston Zoo, you can find them probably here in town somewhere. So after the zoological community started running out of space, instead of sending them back to Panama, every time one of these clutches hatched, they let the tadpoles mature into adults and selected what they thought to be the 60 most healthy animals. They let those 60 animals live and euthanize the rest. When I talked to one of the zookeepers who told me about how she refused to do the work of euthanasia, how she was willing to select what she thought would be the 60 healthiest animals, but would make her boss come in and do the labor of killing, there was another frog biologist sitting at the table. Her name is Karen Lips, and she's among the most renowned biologists working in Central America. And while we were drinking margaritas, Karen talked with woe about just the competing problems of how difficult it is to find a zoo, how mind-numbing the labor of keeping these animals is in the current contemporary moment. But ultimately, Karen just got mad at the situation. She slammed her glass down on the table, spilling margarita everywhere, lifted her hand in a parody of a revolutionary salute, and said, "Live free or die." Our utopia for the golden frog was a concrete proposal for doing the work of biopolitics differently. We created this fridge, put an ecosystem inside, with the idea that something different might happen than euthanasia in this case. When asked why they don't send these animals back to Panama, the zoological community basically says that instead of the zoo being a happy heterotopia that Foucault describes, that it's a hotbed of disease. There's all sorts of parasites that are from all over the world, and their fear is that by sending animals back to Panama, they might be unleashing a new plague in amphibian worlds. So the title of our piece, The Utopia for the Golden Frog, is pregnant with irony. Utopian worlds are ever present in science fiction, where the projections of new heavens is never far from the emergence of new hells. Utopias can also function as diagnostic tools. To paraphrase Isabel Stengers, they are learning grounds for resisting what today opportunistically frames our world. So living in conditions of incarceration is certainly not utopic. Living in a refrigerator is probably not something anyone here would fancy to do, even if it was big enough to fit inside. But rather than communicate a fixed vision of how things should be, this piece was meant to illustrate possible biocultural articulations. So what we did basically is hack the electrical system of this refrigerator. There's an Arduino that we put on board that controlled the temperature, humidity, and lights. It was on a 24-hour cycle. We put a program on there that would keep it in the ideal range for the species as defined by the husbandry manual issued by the Baltimore Zoo and Aquarium. We also put this living ecosystem inside that had mutant fruit flies. You can buy mutant fruit flies on edsflymeat.com, and this is what people feed frogs in zoos these days. Robert Kohler has an excellent book talking about the history of the fruit fly and all the diverse mutants that have been created for biological science. But these mutants have basically gone wild in the pet trade and are a very useful tool for those who are trying to keep amphibians and other forms of life alive in aquaria and terraria inside their own homes. In addition to the Arduino and the living ecosystem that arguably made this fridge more biosecure than a zoo. So in a zoo you have all these animals living cheek and jowl. With this one we had plants generating enough oxygen so that you rarely had to open up the fridge. We had a compost pile inside of a fake log that was all the fruit flies needed to sustain their life. So you basically have to open it up maybe once or twice a week to put new compost in for the flies. So in addition to the Arduino, which took live temperature and humidity readings and posted them to the web, we also put a webcam inside to sort of expose our project to the workings of regular biopolitics. So if Foucault describes the panopticon as the central regime of surveillance that works even if no one's looking, we installed more like an oligopticon. So Latour describes networks that are managed by an oligarchy, where the real-time monitoring of technical data enables them to actually work. So we had the live temperature, live humidity readings, and live images of our utopia online for the authorities to look at and verify that we had met the technical requirements for sustaining this kind of life. So after doing all this, I emailed the stud book holder. And this is the person who owns the species. This is a designation from the Association of Zoos and Aquaria, the AZA, for the person who dynamically documents the pedigree and entire demographic history of each individual in the population of a species. And for frogs, it doesn't usually work on an individual level. There's usually too many, but for things like rhinos, these stud book holders are very attentive to even individual animals. My email asked about how, quote, I might submit a formal application to borrow some Adelopus teki, that's the species name for the golden frog, a formal application to borrow some Adelopus teki adults for a temporary artistic display about the amphibian mass extinction crisis. I'm trying to keep this as vanilla as possible. So I outlined the technical specifications of the frog fridge, adding, the tank doesn't have any running water, so based on what I've learned about the Adelopus reproductive biology, I trust this means the frogs won't be trying to breed. So I didn't want to set up a situation that would lead to more unhappiness, more frogs that would have nowhere to live in the world. The stud book holder wrote a friendly but dismissive note back, saying that he was unable to provide golden frogs for the exhibit since I was not housing it at a zoo, an institution licensed by the AZA. So the law permits people to do research with endangered species, but clearly the sort of research that I was doing didn't fall within their domain of what constituted valid scientific work. If I was to get a permit, and I learned all this by doing a lot of advocacy behind the scenes with real movers and shakers in amphibian worlds, just trying to actually physically get these frogs. So I learned that there were all sorts of bureaucratic protocol that would have to be followed. They would have to clear the internal animal ethics committee of the zoo, and also I'd have to have a specific permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But ultimately, after all of this lobbying, I failed to convince the stud book holder and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife that a few frogs should be saved from euthanasia and kept in our modified refrigerator. The utopia for the golden frog failed to house an actual animal, but perhaps it still succeeded as an artwork, functioning as a critique of dominant practices for managing life and death. Again, to borrow from the words of Isabel Stengers, the installation served as a diagnostic vector for what made it a mere utopia, as a learning ground for resisting today what opportunistically frames our world. Calling up Kevin Zippel, the founder of the Amphibian Arc, I used this artwork as a para-ethnographic object, a way to facilitate an unusual way of speaking with him about the issues at hand. Sharing a link to our website with Zippel, I told him that it was a modest proposal that might let citizen scientists participate in the effort to care for endangered species at a moment where it was really difficult to raise funding for this issue. Playing with his own words, I said, it seems like any way of expanding the carrying capacity of the Ark would be a good thing. I agree, Zippel responded, but a lot of people in the private sector are motivated by the value of these animals. There's a tendency to sell them on the black market. There are just so many complicating factors to citizen involvement, he said. There's people who make money off of the trade of endangered species, who collect them in the wild and sell them as pets. And this is one of the problems that are leading to the extinction of frogs and birds and other animals. Basically, the pressure by consumers is draining these populations of animals in the wild. As the owner of the golden frogs, the stud book holder was entrusted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to guard against their escape into the market for rare and exotic animals. So while they were not too concerned with the fate of individual animals, the ones that they were killing they regarded as having little genetic value. These animals were imagined to be the excess of the breeding programs. Ultimately, their goal was to protect the viability of the frogs in the wild. So it's sort of, instead of placing value on individuals, it's valuing this population, this abstract concept of the species. A small population of golden frogs was recently discovered in Panama. They thought that the golden frog was extinct in 2008, but they've since found some in the wild. And in the minds of conservationists who once thought it was extinct, these living animals have become a living figure of hope and the most genetically valuable members of their species in existence. So the fear of the conservation officials, according to Kevin Zippel, was that people could collect any remaining golden frogs in Panama if there were other animals in circulation in the pet networks. Protecting frogs from market forces, prizing the genetic value of animals over their potential exchange value and use value, does have some merit. Turning animals into commodities for exchange certainly has the potential to bring about troubling regimes of exploitation. But against the backdrop of a grim political and economic situation, leveraging the economic values of these animals might be the best way to actualize Kevin Zippel's conservation goals. So Donna Haraway's talked about lively capital, where use value and exchange value come together with what she calls encounter value. And I think arguably leveraging the exchange value of these animals might lead to new encounters that prompt more to become involved in saving the lives of these species. So the broader picture, panning out from golden frogs for a second, is that this amphibian art that he has created has a very limited capacity. So right now there is about 3,850 frog species that are in danger of extinction. Just think about that number for a second. 3,850 species. That's not animals, that's populations of animals. Kevin's Ark is able to care for 10. So this was a modest proposal for rethinking the logic of endangered species to open it up to new potential caretakers. Kevin Zippel's amphibian ark is fragile. It's needy of care. Many keepers working in facilities associated with the ark told me that they struggled to keep the faith as animals unexpectedly died, or even as entire species went extinct, despite their best efforts. Optimism attached to other living beings, according to Lauren Berlant, can be the cruelest of all. When contingencies beyond one's control result in the death of a loved one, this produces a cruel and jarring slap. Converting despair into hope involves playing with the uneasy alchemy of the pharmacon. The pharmacon is the substance that Plato described, and others, such as Stingers, have more recently animated it. So the pharmacon is the poison that turns into the cure in the right dose, or the cure that becomes a poison, the obstacle that presents an opportunity. So that work of converting despair into hope involves that uneasy alchemy of the pharmacon. Converting from indifference, it's too late. The world is shit. To a more hopeful orientation is difficult. Having someone to care for, and thus caring for what happens, caring for whether or not there is a future, makes it easier to sustain happiness, according to Sarah Ahmed. Hope can involve vulnerability, when you care for that which is beyond or outside your control. Hope, in other words, involves caring about the hap of what happens. So Sarah Ahmed has done a very careful genealogy of happiness to look at the Old English origins of it. So happiness means having hap, or having good hap or good fortune. That's sort of the original, somewhat archaic definition of happiness. And And it seems archaic now, since happiness is not something that money can buy or power can command, but Ahmed insists that we return to this original definition as it refocuses our attention to the worldly question of happenings. Efforts to postpone the process of extinction, to hold species in the suspended animation of what some people have called cryopolitics. So biopolitics, the management of life and death. Cryopolitics from Joanna Radin and Emma Corwall involves the freezing of life, not only in cryogenic banks, but the freezing of life in facilities like the ones that I've been describing today. So those cryopolitical projects seek to control the hap of what happens. Freezing the genetic diversity of living plants or animals within an ark and managing them according to carefully calculated biopolitical rules risks producing and sustaining forms of life that are no longer happy. Managed or directed life does not have hap, as in happenstance opportunity. While holding listless animals inside life support technologies, many conservation biologists are only able to hold on to happiness by imagining the moment when they are given license to break open their fragile bubbles of glass. Their emotional and imaginative labor involves picturing the escape of animals they love from their present circumstances. They imagine a happy future for their loved ones in the wild, beyond regimes of care and control. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there questions?
I don't know if it's so much of a question as a comment that obviously, the kind of general metaphor of the Ark and Noah is framing what your project is all about. And so, the kind of thought of what happens to Noah after he does save the species. Of course, he's in a world filled with iniquity, evil, and so forth, and it's going to be washed clean so that one can start all over again. And I'm just wondering what you see kind of beyond what you've done so far, which I think is very actually interesting sort of experimental anthropology, one might say, to see what would happen if you sort of tease this forth. But the one thing you didn't do in yours was allow, and maybe you could do that, I don't know, put the water into the system so that breeding would take place, and so that competition and evolutionary processes would unfold naturally in some sense. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that portion of the experiment that you conducted, why you did that, given the framing of this in terms of the Noah myth.
So for starters, the mixture of market forces and breeding frogs and endangered species is already happening elsewhere with other species. So you can buy and trade endangered frogs on Craigslist, on places called, Frog Forum. And I've been following a number of species through these networks. One is beautiful. I want to have one. It's called Agolignus annae, and it's the blue-sided leaf frog. And people are managing the life and death of that species where ethics are being worked out alongside market forces in this face-to-face kind of way. So in some ways, you talked about, why not put the water in there? Why not let this take place naturally? It is sort of taking place naturally with other species. With Agolignus annae, that species proved to be difficult to be enfolded into that relationship. I think these relationships are what Isabel Stingers would characterize as reciprocal capture, where a change happens not only to the animal that's brought into and enfolded into these relations with people, into these technologies of life support that are cobbled together from various sources, but a change happens to the people. You have to comport yourself in new ways to take care of these animals. So Agolignus annae didn't turn out to work so well in that system. Another one that's less beautiful has. So I'm going to forget the name of the other one, but it's basically a small black frog with yellow racing stripes down the side. And that one you can buy at a site called Josh's Frogs, for example, for like $35 each. And those are endangered species that you can't import to the U.S. anymore, but that sort of get around the law by already being here. They were brought into the country before they were formally designated as an endangered species. As for the metaphor or the trope of Noah, in some ways, and I think you can detect this in the talk, I'm sort of celebrating the promise of the Messianic and celebrating the potential of breaking out of homogeneous empty time where these predictable processes seem to be functioning and not moving in response to our modest intervention. So trying to imagine what needs to take place to wrangle with these impending distinctions of 3,300 and some odd kinds of frogs. So I think the Messianic has potential here, but ultimately Kevin failed with his project. He stepped down after a few years at the helm of Amphibian Arc. He's no longer with the organization, and the new director has much less of that Messianic rhetoric. And I guess, yeah, with any metaphor, with any trope, it both reveals and conceals. There's problems with any mode of emplotment, as Hayden White reminds us. So I guess, yeah, there's I don't think ever going to be that sort of new happy beginning where the slate is wiped clean, but how might we mobilize these often troubling tropes, these assemblages of nature and technology, and bring them together to illuminate new possibilities in the world. I guess that's what the project's about.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's kind of timely, your talk, and especially the different allusions to Noah, the Ark, Susan Harding, and Christian fundamentalism, and then Thomas Dunlap had actually spoken here last week. So I wanted to ask if in some ways the project is aligning with Dunlap's call of kind of viewing environmentalism and environmental activism as an execution of religion, or environmentalism as religion. If this is a successful model for change and how it has its pitfalls. You kind of mentioned it a little bit, but if you want to speak more to that.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with his work, and I think I would just reiterate what I said, that, I mean, and also I've spent the better part of last week with Kim Tallbear, who reminded me of all of the problematic legacies that Christianity imposes on native belief systems and all of the ways that indigenous folks are working through multi-species relations with a very different lexicon, a lexicon that is sort of outside the God the Father narrative, that is about shared responsibility in that sense of being able to respond, where relations is the key word of multi-species worlds and also cosmological worlds. So, this all my relations thing that gets reiterated in sweat lodges is and has been appropriated by whites and others and watered down, is the key word of Kim's new project, where she's thinking indigenous multi-species relations, not only with these kinds of life I'm characterizing, but also things like stones. So I think we all start from a philosophical starting point. We all have assumptions about cosmology, phenomenology, epistemology, ontology, and I don't think any one of these belief systems is going to save the day. So I think because these tropes are so dominant and powerful in the world we live in, it's important to use them and subject them to critical scrutiny. But I would also point to projects like Kim's and other work that is using different things to grapple with the contemporary reality.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. My own work is on nostalgia, and I have often thought about nostalgia in terms of nature and this nostalgia for a lost Eden, things like that. And I think it particularly comes out around particular endangered or extinct species. So I was wondering if that's something you've thought about in this work in terms of kind of separating out critical need in terms of a biome versus kind of just a nostalgia for a time when these frogs were plentiful, or where they're imagined culturally, religiously.
Yeah, I think often what we perceive as being the needs and interests of another can result in violence to that other and result in violence to what that other might want. Another chapter of the book, the chapter that I circulated to some of the grad students living with parasites, is about nostalgia for a particular moment, 1978, when there were a lot of birds, there were a lot of diversity in this one particular wetland in Costa Rica. And I think it's ultimately impossible to know what that system was like in 1978. And but at the same time, as with some of these Messianic tropes, I think nostalgia can animate a lot of conservation practices that are bringing and revivifying endangered lifeways in some important ways. The broader argument of the book is a pretty hard push against these rear-looking visions of nature, saying that rather than paying attention to the past, what we should be doing is thinking about the interplay of interests in contemporary multi-species communities that we can see around us, attending to those interests, asking the question of cui bono, who benefits when species meet, but then not just being a descriptive project, but imagining surprising futures at the intersection of these forces, imagining what Anna Singh describes as coalescences, the world-making power of chance encounter, contingent connection that produces new things in the world. So I think that, yeah, nostalgia's there, and I guess, yeah, ultimately I see less utility for something like nostalgia than the force of, say, the Messianic.
I also wanted to thank you for the talk. I thought it was really rich. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the third term in your title, the glass part. Of course, we saw a lot of glass in the images that you showed. But I was wondering a little bit, and now this isn't thought out so well, so bear with me a little bit, but I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the call to break open empty homogeneous time, whether we do that via Benjamin or Derrida or whatever, right? But when you do that, although Derrida asks us to expect nothing, right? But this is where the problem of glass becomes, I think, particularly important. Derrida's own book, Glass, of course, is often thought of as being autobiographical in many ways, and I think about it too, glass is like a mirror, right? It sort of functions frequently in that way, and it's making me wonder about if we're to break open this messianic time, isn't the danger there that it becomes quite a narcissistic project of glass, right? And then I'm linking that to your exegesis of hope, in particular happiness, which was a very English American geography, and a lot of the discussion about Tom Dunlap's talk that we heard on Friday was how unrelentingly Anglo-American it was, and its vision of what environmentalism was, or what some sort of Anthropocene future might look like. So that's some collective observations, but maybe you could talk about glass and both its dangers and its possibilities.
Yeah, I think there was something of that, in that looking in the glass, and in this narcissistic way in Kevin Zippel's project, and I heard some of the rank and file of amphibian biologists feeling that, like the Kevin Zippel's narcissism was sort of getting in the way of his messianic vision. For me, the notion of glass that I'm responding to is less Derrida, and I really struggle with that book. That book is so hard. But Peter Sloterdijk's new 3-volume series on bubbles and spheres, and I think Sloterdijk is one of those thinkers that I at moments love and other moments hate, and I think he's ultimately very fun to play with, but makes some really wrong-headed starting assumptions, and also has very bad politics. So for Sloterdijk, the notion of the bubble in some ways starts from the Umwelt. There's a playful rereading of the Umwelt and his notion of bubbles or foam. And so for starters, Sloterdijk imagines himself to be the second coming of Heidegger, which is also strange and messianic and narcissistic. And in that, he's rearticulated the tripartite thesis of stone is worldless, animal is foreign world, and human is world forming. And this is where I take him to task in the book to show how chytrids are doing more of this world forming work than humans. So Sloterdijk's version of that tripartite thesis is that the human is an ontological amphibian. So if the animal is trapped in a cage, trapped in an Umwelt, the human is choosing amongst worlds, choosing amongst ontologies to inhabit and creating new ones. And paying very close attention to the molecular biology of chytrids, I use them to shatter Sloterdijk's self-blown bubbles of illusion, these lonely Umwelts where humans are the only ones transforming the world. And I guess in this project, in addition to reacting against Sloterdijk's rearticulation of the Umwelt, but still playing with this notion of ontological amphibians. So I'm describing a number of literal amphibians, but also ontological amphibians like the xenopus frogs that were used in the pregnancy test that the video illustrated in the beginning, as well as some ants and chytrids and plants. Just trying to think of breaking open the glass as a way of letting in a new form of wildness into these conservation projects. So if the old wild was thinking about things that are beyond the domain of domestication, things like wild geese or wild boar that are outside the farm, Sarah Franklin has described new forms of wildness emerging within regimes of hyper-cultivation. So I guess I'm wondering, outside of what might break out of these glass spheres that conservationists are building. If this arc is a fragile thing that is vulnerable, that's going to break down, what sort of contingent piecemeal articulations of biology and technology can we assemble in the present configurations of glass that are assembled into an architecture of immunology and infrastructure of care? If we build that now, what possible features might emerge from that? So I guess that's sort of where I'm trying to go.
Thanks for the talk and towards the book. The question I had, I really liked how you began the talk by drawing attention to chytrids and the ways in which they remind us that actually humans kind of change other kinds of processes that are beyond their control, causing a large scale and extinction. Right? As you went on to describe the amphibian arc, and particularly like these biopolitical and cryopolitical processes, it seemed a lot like the scientists had a lot of power over the life of these frogs, and got less of a sense of how the frogs actually matter to be encountered at all. If you could say a little bit more about how the frogs in the story actually may have questions that Lockean, Christian idea didn't mean open nature, and probably the distinction a little bit in there being behind the glass a bit more.
So I think the moment in the paper where I engage with that is talking about the big toothy grins of the primates that are hovering around, and I think I've lived with frogs in my house. While writing that, I decided to become a participant observer. So Steve became a member of my household. So one of the chapters is called Multi-Species Families, and it's about people who breed birds in their houses and also snakes and frogs, some which are more personable than others. And I'll plug the event we're doing next week. We're doing an event with Peter Singer and the Israeli scholar Daphna. I'm going to butcher Daphna's last name. But Daphna has come up with this remarkable notion of the flexible person, and to think about flexible personhood in human multi-species households is to think about the ways not only that we engage in these anthropomorphic impositions on animals, calling them babies and kin, but to also think about the shared social spaces that are created but the situation of asymmetrical risk and vulnerability that exists in those households. So her article's focused on dogs, and I've imported what she's said about these multi-species families that change radically after a divorce or after the birth of a human, where the animal's suddenly abandoned by the roadside or taken to the Humane Society and euthanized, to think about dynamics involving other species that are more or less personable. So in the case of some birds, I found that, yeah, some like budgies and macaws and just a diversity of parrot species are very capable of entering into these shared spaces where it's not simply a anthropomorphic imposition to regard them as kin, but where there seems to be a shared space of happiness, shall we say, and even avian-centric projections onto people. So while I interviewed this retiree named Carolyn in her single-wide mobile home in Miami, Florida, she was telling me about her babies. Peeps flew up and started having sex with her hand. So it was not just these anthropomorphic impositions, but exploring these shared spaces of happiness. With frogs, well, with snakes would rather just die. in most households, like some, like corn snakes, have gotten along fairly well in human households. Ball pythons, which are bought and sold for thousands of dollars, are named for their fear response. They basically curl up into a ball when they're afraid, and this is what they do when they're around people for most of the time. I think frogs are sort of between snakes and birds. I mean, frogs, I think, are generally terrified of us when we're around them. Keeping them in glass exposes them to surveillance, exposes them to all sorts of conditions of discomfort. But caring for Steve in my home, I learned both how to provide the sorts of infrastructure inside of his cage that led to comportment that other people taught me to see as happy, but then also explored moments where he might hop around an apartment and thinking about how to bring hap and contingency into his life world was also part of our project. Steve became very unhappy when he got sick, and we started treating him with iodine baths. He would squirt pee. That's the common fear response of frogs when they're picked up and they're unhappy, is they send a jet of urine. But eventually he got to like the bath, and he would just chill out in the bath. If we got the right temperature, he seemed to do fine. So I think it's very easy in a multi-species family or any sort of multi-species encounter to project anthropocentric norms about sociality or happiness or well-being onto a vulnerable animal. And I think Ahmed's stories about affect aliens in human households need to be redoubled when we're thinking about affect as it plays out in these multi-species worlds. And very often, again, our norms are doing violence to the ones that we love.
I was wondering if, in addition to the awareness of the existence and the living of frogs.
I missed that one word. The existence?
Yeah, existence of the frogs on the earth. There is also the awareness of extinction of frogs' calls.
Frog calls?
Frog calls, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have read you up to two pieces. Then you introduce some biologists description of their calls. Then I sense that they, to a certain extent, pay some attention to these calls. So.
Mm-hmm. Before the talk, we were talking about my dear friend Jody Rowley, who's an amphibian taxonomist, who, in her accounting of what she describes as small brown frogs from Vietnam, this what was previously regarded as a cryptic species complex, meaning that there's a lot of genetic heterogeneity and evolutionary diversity lingering in forms that we can barely differentiate because they all look like small brown frogs to us. She told me about how the calls are what enable her to describe species now. So a call that would to us sound like a grasshopper or a katydid Jody's able to recognize simply with her own ears, oh, that's a new species of leptolelax that I've never heard. And in part, it has to do with emerging forms of technology. So starting in the 1990s, a bunch of studies were done in Panama with the Tungara frog, where Stan Rand, a senior Smithsonian scientist, started playing frog calls from different species that were of the same genus, but not the same species, and looked at orientation responses of Tungara frogs to these calls, and found that there was extreme fidelity within the species. There were a few species where occasionally the call was similar enough that there was a little bit of response, but mostly they were acoustically and perceptually invisible to each other, and there was no sort of differentiation between those other species calls and blasts of noise. So based on those findings, people like Jody have started to record the calls of frogs as part of their field work when they're doing descriptive taxonomy. Now, it's not just about the snout length, the eye width, and all these other sort of morphometric measurements that you make in describing a frog species. It's not just the DNA sequences that you're depositing in GenBank to verify, like, okay, there is a significant difference in nucleotides, but part of the emerging practice is to account for these calls. And right now these calls are just archived on Jody's website, and probably not that many people pay attention to them outside of realms of taxonomy and very specific place-based ecology. But yeah, we were just talking about sort of imaginative ways to bring art and ethnography into that mix to make these creatures that are on the brink of disappearance more vivid, knowable, and intelligible to us primates who have a very limited perceptual range.
Three-part question. There's this fungus, but is there evidence that general environmental change would be endangering amphibians even if that fungus did not exist? Or two, is science trying to counter the fungus, either controlling it or blocking it? And the third thing is, either purposely or accidentally, have species of frogs that are immune or at least resistant to the fungus been introduced in new areas to replace the frogs that are becoming extinct?
Yep. So maybe I'll work backwards. So many species of frogs can harbor BD infections, and that's the brief way of saying the name of the fungal species that's responsible. The full name is Bacocochytrium dendrobatitis. And one thing I didn't do in this talk, which I'm careful to do in the book, is talk about all the amazing things that other kinds of chytrids do. So chytrids are responsible for breaking down cellulose and chitin, very hard to digest molecules without, and this is sort of my poke at Peter Sloterdijk. Peter Sloterdijk's trying to think about the sort of work processes that go into sustaining life-giving bubbles of people. And I'm saying you've never thought about the life-giving reworking of death back into life that chytrids do. But that's a whole side conversation. And your question was about amphibians that carry BD infections and spread them into new areas. So for a while, it was just thought that so-called invasive species like xenophis, like bullfrogs, were the vectors spreading this around, but it turns out that lots of endemic frogs in a particular area also can have asymptomatic infections. So the red-eyed tree frog, for example, which is very popular in the pet trade here, but also very abundant, experiencing no declines in Central America, can harbor BD with no problems. And it's a regional vector that's one of those agents that's helping the disease move 15 miles a year. BD also infects crayfish and has catastrophic effects on crayfish populations. It can also live on geese toes, apparently, for up to 24 hours. The little zoospores can hover around in a drop of water with no host, and geese are helping it spread. A lot of the earlier science was suggesting that people were one of the key agents, and actually accusing amphibian biologists of killing their subjects of study by not washing their boots between field sites. Let's see. So other things besides BD and then controlling BD. Some of the interesting work that's coming out of some of the labs that I'm studying that I chronicle elsewhere in the book is the way that the microbiome of amphibians is starting to be manipulated to look at dynamics of competitive exclusion on their skin. So there's some microbes that confer an immunity, and that actually, like bacteria, that will generate antifungal compounds. So the idea is that inoculating some of these vulnerable species with microorganisms that are flourishing on the skin of the species that aren't experiencing declines, that might be one way to try to intervene, but it turns out to be super complicated. So that might or might not work in inoculating frogs with a microbiome of others. So that's one way to control it. It's pretty simple to control it if you have a pet frog and it's diagnosed with BD. So we did these tests of xenopus, which are being sold in New York. You can buy them in a corner pet store for $2.88. You can use those same frogs for pregnancy tests. We did a performative art experiment to sort of unearth this surprising hidden history of xenopus chytrids in the pet trade. But when we swabbed all our frogs, we found that none of them actually had the BD as predicted. If they were infected, it's super easy to just buy Lamisil or another antifungal treatment off the shelf, dilute it in water, and give your frog a bath every day for a week. You also asked about other things besides BD that are killing frogs. Global warming was thought to be a major force for a while. There was a series of cover articles on the issue in Science, published by Alan Pounds in the 90s. It turns out the story of Bufo peregrines, a toad in Costa Rica, probably did have something to do with El Nino and global warming, though the initial declines were probably a result of chytrid infections. The very last populations of Bufo peregrines were found in these little ponds that basically dried up. There's other things like pesticides, obviously habitat loss, the same sort of dynamics affecting other kinds of life that are impinging on the life worlds of frogs. And I think this disease has been singled out by the conservation community as something that's exceptional, in part because there's a techno-scientific fix. You can, do something with science to fix it.
Yeah, I had a question about art and about your framing of part of your ethnographic practice as artistic. I thought about this email that you quoted to us, to the book holder, which you described as being very vanilla. But the one vanilla, not vanilla thing in it, I think, was your use of the term art. Right? Because if you look at the Endangered Species Act, the exceptions to taking, or restrictions on taking, are for things like conservation, research, and education. They're not for crazy art projects that somebody thought of. So framing something as art puts it in a category that falls outside of those sort of classic regulatory categories. And so I thought, well, what if instead you said, I have an educational project?
Yeah.
And what if instead of doing it in a phrase that you built yourself, DIY, you teamed up with the Science Museum, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy. You know much more about the actual bureaucracy and regulatory practices, but it's possible for me to imagine it was a great answer with all of them.
Yeah.
And so there's something specifically about framing that art that puts in a different category, and about doing kind of art that operates in a kind of DIY space or grassroots space that's outside of these institutional structures that are kind of pre-legitimate. And so it seems to me that the reason that you have good reasons to do that, right? To operate in that space and to reject those institutional ties and to frame this art rather than as education. And that this is tied, I think, to your imagination of the quote, right? And the Messianic promise. And I just wonder if you could speak more to that, like why you see that form of practice as the site for this, rather than forms that would ally you with these big institutions that already have.
Yeah, so in short, the answer I got back was exactly that response. So if so at the time I was volunteering as a keeper at the Bronx Museum, and they said, if you bring your fridge to the Bronx Museum and you want to install it there, that's fine. And that was sort of the informal response that I got after the formal rejection. And so maybe I'll speak to art first, and then I'll speak to why I was trying to work in DIY spaces. So part of how I understand these interventions now is with the help of Delia Hanna, who's coined the term performative experiments to talk about artworks that either take an established scientific protocol and exhibit them in a new space, or queer them in a sense. So Delia is using the notion of performativity, both thinking about the performative turn in science and technology studies, but also Butler's notion of performing gender, to think about how trans performance highlights and problematizes things about real men and real women that we take for granted. So for Delia, the performative experiment is queering science in that way, that exposes standard protocol to critical inspection, and in some cases, it exposes it to ridicule. So there's a couple of performative experiments that I've highlighted in this book, and experimenting with these modes of, not only using scientific tools and techniques to gather new empirical information, like do these frogs have chytrid, do they have BD fungus, but also to use these interventions as a more playful way of opening up the black box of science and interrogating it with the tools of STS. So that's part of what we're trying to do in an art world, is make a performative experiment that not only is sort of critical of dominant regimes of biopolitics, but making these proposals for doing it differently. And the reason I think it's important to break out of these institutional spaces in this particular case is because the big institutions are failing. The zoos have to pay their electricity bills. The zoos have to have staff on hand to monitor something. Even if it was that fridge brought to the Bronx Zoo, they would still have to have one of their staff people add a new thing to their daily routine, which is already overburdened. There's thousands upon thousands of animals behind the scenes that are not being exhibited. Twisty the crocodile, who is 60 and who's lived with a deformed spine in a tank that's about that long and that wide for his whole life, is just one of the more vivid examples of the sort of undead that's being kept back there. And this move into DIY spaces was saying, okay, there's this massive thing going on, this story that is so big that it paralyzes us. And in the face of the paralyzing power of these big stories, how might we invent new practices in new spaces that are making hopeful articulations? So that's why in a DIY space, rather than taking my fridge to the Bronx Zoo.
Okay, we'll get one last question. Did you?
Yeah, I have one. One of the things I found really compelling was how many people you brought into it, the individuals that were doing the research from different perspectives or caring for the animals. Can you talk a little bit about how their end goals differ? Because I have to imagine that, your end goal is very different from the people at the Baltimore Zoo who aren't able to send these creatures back. And I'm curious about these end goals, because I'm not sure I know after your talk what any of your end goals were, and yet I certainly don't know how they interact with one another. And I'm sure you've thought a lot about that through your ethnographic work.
Yeah, and I think rather than being fixated on a single teleology, I think it's trying to think about the wild possibilities that might emerge from any particular conjecture of institutional forces or assemblages of biotic technological components in a given space. So I think it's more of an openness. Maybe it is an element of that, like waiting in the desert, expecting the unexpected, where I do see hopes emerging. But I think in contrast to Derrida, it's I'm trying to think very clearly about the concrete hopes that involve prefiguring changes and not being. So my first book is about another hopeless situation. It's about indigenous people living under a military occupation in a part of the world that no one here, maybe there's someone here who's heard of West Papua, but it's not sort of one of the big conflicts that's on the geopolitical map. And Papuans taught me to think about the unexpected and think about hopes that quickly grab onto one thing, whether that's a living person, a historical figure, an imagined event, or something else, and bring that, invest that thing, that figure, with the Messianic spirit. And when in those moments of arrival, when the dictator leaves, when the gringo leaves, or when Kevin Zippel arrives, or Obama arrives, there's often disappointment in those moments of arrival and moments when that thing fails to arrive. And I guess the question is, when in the face of those ongoing disappointments that are what the contingency of life is all about, what do you do with hope? Do you give up on hope and occupy this place of despair, or do you figure out a way to re-territorialize your hopes and grab onto something new? And that's what the Papuans were very good at. They were very good at grounding concrete hopes in particular moments or in particular figures, but then in the face of perpetual disappointment, they were ever able to grab onto new things.
Thank you so much.
A lot of them do so, right? Angie, one of my closest friends, and I think the most